Welcome back to the series, Our Living National Constitution, Its History and Evolving Interpretation. I'm Edward J. Dodson. This is Lecture 7, titled Franklin Roosevelt's Temporary Victory Against Plutocracy. Franklin D. Roosevelt was sworn in as the new President of the United States on the 4th of March, 1933. 2 days later, he issued a proclamation ordering the suspension of all banking transactions effective immediately for 1 full week. Holders of U.S. currency had lost faith in paper money and had been redeeming their dollars for gold, so much so that the New York Federal Reserve Bank's gold reserve had fallen below the legal limit. The U.S. Congress passed the Emergency Banking Act on the 13th of March. The Federal Reserve provided member banks with loans of needed currency, secured by the member bank's own assets. The run on the bank subsided, although 4,000 banks would remain closed forever. A bill for the free coinage of silver at a value of 16 to 1 to gold almost passed in the United States Senate, and this pushed Roosevelt to leave the gold standard. An embargo was placed on gold on the 19th of April, and a law passed that prohibited the issuance of bonds, whether governmental or corporate, payable in gold. One objective was to stop the deflation of prices and of asset values. Roosevelt's next test of his constitutional authority was a bill aimed at raising crop prices by offering payments to farmers to leave part of their acreage unplanted. The revenue required was to be raised by a sales tax paid by consumers. A bill was then passed to provide $3.3 billion for public works projects to be undertaken by the Civilian Conservation Corps. Over time, however, a good portion of this fund was diverted into direct relief and national defense. Roosevelt was far from over with the New Deal. The Tennessee Valley Authority Act of 1933 created a new federal agency charged with solving the problem of flooding, providing electricity to the region, and replanting forests. To address the unavailability of long-term, fixed-rate, and fully amortizing mortgage loans, the Homeowners Loan Corporation was established to help owners of a residential property who were at risk of foreclosure. Under the National Housing Act of 1934, the Federal Housing Administration was created. FHA regulated interest rates and mortgage terms and provided mortgage insurance to protect lending institutions from loss in the event the pre-approved borrower defaulted. Congress passed the Securities Act of 1933 on the 27th of May, which required firms that sell securities to the public disclose material information about the company and the security. The act was to be enforced by the Securities and Exchange Commission, created by the Exchange Act of 1934. Next came the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, implemented and enforced by the National Recovery Administration. Roosevelt was now authorized to regulate industry to gain fair wages and prices that it was hoped would stimulate economic recovery. Importantly, the act guaranteed trades unions rights and permitted the regulation of working standards. A public works administration was also created. Soon, however, the huge flow of regulations generated organized opposition from the business community. These steps by the federal government would hopefully stimulate private investment in tangible capital goods, bringing workers back and, as a result, the demand for goods and services. Unfortunately, speculators were also given reason for renewed interest in the stock market, as Frederick Lewis Allen writes. So violently did the stock market boil, so frequently were there 5 and 6 million share days, that the total volume of trading in the month of June 1933 and again in the month of July 1933 was greater than it had been in any single month in the bull market of 1929, with the sole exception of the panic month of October. Quickly enough, the stock market fell back as speculators tried to take their gains. As always happens, this led to heavy selling and falling share prices. The National Recovery Administration's decisions brought William Randolph Hearst to use a full page of his newspaper to condemn the Recovery Act as, quote, a measure of absolute state socialism and a menace to political rights and constitutional liberties. At the same time, the beginning of today's largest family fortune, that of the Koch brothers, was being built by Fred Koch, a chemical engineer who took his talents to the Soviet Union and then to Germany to assist those countries develop their domestic oil refining capacity. Despite the fact that part of his fortune came from government-funded contracts in the Soviet Union, Fred Koch's ideology was libertarian and anti-government. This would emerge after the end of World War II and his anti-communist membership in the John Birch Society and his commitment to reversal of Roosevelt New Deal legislation. With the economy not really responding to the package of programs already underway, with business activity resisting the National Recovery Administration, and with farm prices still falling, Roosevelt announced on the 22nd of October 1933 that the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was going to buy gold for the government. The experiment continued until the end of January 1934, when the dollar had been significantly devalued in terms of gold. Prices of other goods had risen somewhat, but nowhere near proportionately. If things were not already bad enough, late in 1933, the first of the great dust storms began across South Dakota. The sky darkened the next day in Chicago, and the following day as far east as Albany, New York. Over the next 2 years, thousands of square miles of the nation's agricultural soil was blown away. Heat, minimal rain, and poor soil management combined to bring on what was named the Dust Bowl. More than 300,000 and perhaps as many as 400,000 people left their homes on the Great Plains and made their way to California. Frederick Lewis Allen adds a few details. They left behind them a half-depopulated countryside. A survey of the farmhouses in 7 counties of southeastern Colorado, made in 1936, showed 2,878 houses still occupied, 2,811 abandoned, and there were also in that area 1,522 abandoned home sites. By 1933, the magnitude of the Great Depression suggested to Edward C. Harwood, a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy, the need for a research organization to inquire into the wide range of economic, social, and monetary developments that had contributed to the catastrophic economic contraction. The hope was that by further developing and applying modern scientific procedures of inquiry, results could be obtained that would be useful to the nation in avoiding a repetition of the disaster. On the advice of Dr. Vannevar Bush, then Vice President of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Harwood founded the American Institute for Economic Research to conduct the necessary investigations. His analysis, Cause and Cure of the Business Cycle, was published in 1932. Harwood put much of the blame on the nation's money credit mechanism, but also saw the causes as systemic. He wrote, "The short-term problem of the business cycle is different from the long-term problem that confronts our civilization, which is a distribution of wealth and privilege that threatens the equality of opportunity essential to the preservation of democracy." In 1934, Harwood wrote a response to the open letter by John Maynard Keynes addressed to Franklin Roosevelt. Harwood's response appeared as a featured article in the New York Times. I have not been able to find any evidence that Keynes commented. A year after the stock market crash, a professor of economics at the University of Missouri named Harry Gunnison Brown responded to the growing support for government to take over essential private enterprises. His message came almost directly from what he had absorbed from the study of Henry George's works on political economy. Set capital and labor free from monopoly. Lift the burden of taxation from the manufacturer and businessman. Make land with its natural resources as accessible to every citizen of the United States as it was to Robinson Crusoe. And there will be little talk of communism or Sovietism. In 1935, the nation got the Social Security Act, a national system of unemployment insurance and old age assistance funded by payroll taxes, another level of governmental intervention. The first benefits were paid out in 1937. Professor Satterman tells us that the future of labor relations next arose as a major challenge for Roosevelt. The Wagner Act of 1935, which created the National Labor Relations Board and the system of collective bargaining, had fulfilled part of a restructuring of labor relations into constitutional terms. Then on the 27th of May 1935, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a unanimous decision, declared the National Recovery Administration unconstitutional. The court ruled that the federal government did not have the authority to dictate to individual businesses or individuals, as their activities were by definition intrastate, regardless of where they actually did business. Within a few days, the president responded. The big issue is this. Does this decision mean that the United States government has no control over any economic problems? We have been relegated to the horse and buggy definition of interstate commerce, the biggest question that has come before this country outside of time of war, and it has to be decided. In 1936, the Republicans nominated Alf Landon to run against Roosevelt. The sitting president still had the confidence of the voters, and he received nearly 61% of the vote. His message contained in his inaugural address set his agenda for the next 4 years. I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. It is not in despair that I paint for you that picture. I paint it for you in hope, because the nation, seeing and understanding the injustice in it, proposes to paint it out. We are determined to make every American citizen the subject of his country's interest and concern, and we will never regard any faithful law-abiding group within our borders as superfluous. The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much, it is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. The economy had improved, sufficiently so that workers of General Motors started a sit-down strike lasting more than a month. Steel workers followed them but failed to win a new contract. And a disastrous flood occurred, sending water over the banks of the Ohio River. Amidst all this, Roosevelt came up with a plan to gain a majority of liberal justices on the U.S. Supreme Court. After strong pushback from the leading figures in the nation and his own party, Roosevelt backed off. What Roosevelt did get was appointment of the liberal Senator Hugo Black to the court. It was not very long before Roosevelt was able to see 3 more liberals, Stanley Reed, William O. Douglas, and Felix Frankfurter, appointed. He then had a strong majority of justices who shared his perspectives on what the Constitution permitted. In 1937, the Supreme Court confirmed the power of Congress to regulate employers whose operations affect interstate commerce, even though they were not directly engaged in commerce. This was a major victory for the administration. The New Deal programs had done as much as they were going to accomplish, given that none of the advice given by John Dewey or Harry Gunnison Brown and countless others had been taken to address the systemic problems with how the government raised needed revenue. By the autumn of 1937, stock prices had fallen again and overall business activity was down. Some 2 million workers were thrown out of work in the space of a few months. A main reason, government spending had dried up and private sector spending was insufficient. In April of 1938, Roosevelt accepted the need for renewed government spending and asked Congress to appropriate $3 billion for relief, public works, housing, flood control, and other recovery efforts. The stock market found its bottom in March and business activity hit bottom in May. Toward the end of June, stock prices began to climb. World affairs now began to intervene. In his annual message to Congress in January 1939, Roosevelt called for American unity in the face of foreign threats. The Congress voted for a significant increase in spending for armaments. Still, there were more than 9 million people unemployed, and the agricultural sector continued to require heavy subsidies. And Professor Satterman tells us war in both Asia and Europe brought changes to politics in the United States. With World War II at the center of events, Roosevelt grew increasingly careful in picking his domestic battles. He appointed Republicans to his cabinet and protested little when Congress rolled back some of his signature New Deal programs. An important constitutional question was fast approaching, namely whether Franklin Roosevelt should be the Democratic Party candidate for the office of president in 1940. The Constitution established no term limit, but no other sitting president had sought a third term. After Roosevelt made his decision to run for a third term, he campaigned very little, remaining in Washington, D.C. most of the time. When the votes were counted, Roosevelt captured 55% of the total and was voted in by the Electoral College. The United States' entrance into the Second World War after the Japanese attack on the naval base in the Hawaiian Islands essentially set aside questions of presidential authority under the Constitution. Debate over the causes of the Depression and over policy solutions ended. The nation had entered the beginning of the era of what John Kenneth Galbraith referred to as countervailing power. For the next 4 decades, the U.S. domestic and foreign policy would be influenced by the interests of big business, big labor, and big government. On the 12th of April 1945, Franklin Roosevelt succumbed to a cerebral hemorrhage while in Warm Springs, Georgia. Harry S. Truman became president, with the huge responsibility of leading the nation through the final months of World War II. On the 25th of April, he traveled to San Francisco to address the first United Nations conference. He stated, "If we do not want to die together in war, we must learn to live together in peace. We must build a new world, a far better world, one in which the eternal dignity of man is respected." After the United States dropped a second atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Nagasaki, the Japanese surrendered to General Douglas MacArthur in Tokyo Bay. Anyone who believed the world was entering a new period of peace and prosperity was almost immediately brought back to reality by unfolding events. And that is the end of Lecture 7.